difficult to say, oh, this is traumatic. We go instead, you should be happy you're in America.
Yeah.
You should be happy you're in a beautiful place where you have everything, right?
Yes.
Beautiful roads, nice cars, you're living in a good house. How dare you be homesick?
Yes. And that is, when you think about it, right? That's adding insult to injury. And when I say that, I do not say that to make anyone who's ever said something like that wrong. I have said things like that to my kids before. I'm like, you do not know how good you have it, when there's telling me about something that's bothered them. And then I think, you know what? They are expressing their feelings and what's going on inside of them to me. And instead of me using shame, which we can talk about what shame is, instead of me using shame, I can use something called attunement. And attunement is where I'm going to give them my attention, and I'm going to get regulated back myself. Like, I'm going to make sure I'm emotionally calm, and I'm going to give them acceptance of what they're saying. I'm not saying that what they're doing is right or wrong. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying this is how they're feeling, and it is what it is. And this is something that I didn't experience, until probably when I met my husband, probably until I was 18 or 19. I did not grow up in a house where my mother used to joke that the three things that they used to parent us were shame, blame, and guilt. And which probably explains why I'm sitting in front of you here today doing this. But when you think about shame, it's a very, very common parenting tactic. And a lot of us have been parented through shame. So if you're okay with it, I'll explain what shame is.
I definitely, because my next question was going to be, when I looked at your bio, Dr. Lee, what you sent me, you said, the last paragraph said, Lee uses her 15 years plus of experience in healthcare, psychology, and education to empower people in the development of safe, healthy, and shame-free personal and professional relationships.
Yeah.
The shame-free part caught my attention, like, okay, why is there so much emphasis on the shame-free piece, right? So shame has a big part to play. So you tell us.
Yeah, shame is a really fascinating human thing. So shame, if we look way back in terms of how we've evolved as humans, if we look way back at that, shame used to be necessary. Shame was actually a helpful thing to help us survive. So, example, if there are 30 of us in our tribe, and we have our small area where we live, and one of our kiddos goes off and brings a bear home into our camp. That bear could kill everybody. That bear could cause massive destruction and trauma. So what we would use shame for in that setting is we would shame that person, and we would say, if you do that again, you will be shunned. You will be cut off from the group, because if we don't cut you off, we all are in danger. Now, the fascinating thing is that fast forward tens of thousands of years, a lot of that evolutionary programming, that hardwiring is still within us. And there are very few scenarios in which, if we do not shame our children, we will not survive. And so this is a conscious choice that we have to make, because if we don't think about this, we will use shame first. So shame is a feeling that we get when we feel cut off from the group. And there's four main times that we experience shame. Oh, I think someone is unmuted. There's four main times that we experience shame. So when we experience, most of us experience shame when we have something called unrequited love. And unrequited love is where here's a perfect example. I'm 4 and I go running up to my mom and I'm like, mom, watch this. Look at this. This is amazing. Watch this, please. Mom, can you watch this? Can you? And the mom's like, uh-huh, with their phone. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Right. And what that child experiences is, okay, I am not as important as the thing that's going on in front of here. I've tried to show my mom something that I love. I've tried to give her love, and I don't get that back. And so that's just a tiny micro piece of shame. Yeah, another bigger example of unrequited love would be, I don't know if anybody did this in school. I don't know if you all did this in Cameroon, but we would write each other notes and it would say, do you like me? Check yes or no, the box, when you're 10 or 12. And getting that no box checked back, or having somebody read that note at the front of the room, right? I don't know if anyone can feel that in their body, but I can feel that in my body right now. Of, oh my gosh, I would feel so much shame around that. That's unrequited love. That's also another example of unwanted exposure. And that's where an example of this would be, I bring somebody up in front of the group and I tell everybody how bad they've been, how wrong they've behaved. And so that is another place where we would experience shame as humans. And we do that still to this day in specific ways in our legal system, in our social media. We will do that sometimes. And the third type of shame is exclusion. And this is what we just talked about, right? If you do that again, you will be excluded from the group. And a lot of teenagers, this is a big place that we see with teenagers, right? If you don't have the right clothes, if you don't speak correctly, if you're not in the right social groups, if you're not doing things the way that others expect you to. And when you think about this from an immigrant standpoint, if I don't know the social rules and I've just moved here and there's all of these unwritten social rules, I might not fit in and feel really excluded because I'm different than everybody else and I feel judged for that. And then the last form of shame is called disappointment expectation. And this is where we get really excited about something and then it doesn't happen. This is where we kind of get vulnerable and put ourselves out on a limb and say, hey, I really want to do this. So this would be, maybe I'm 18 and I go to my parents and I say, hey, I really don't want to go to college. I would like to go to culinary school, or I would like to take a gap year and go travel. Or I would like to do something, maybe we've had the same career for 5 generations in our family. And I say, you know what? I don't want to go into that career. I want to do this. And having your family member, your caregiver go, no, absolutely not. You will not do that. You will not, think about the language you use. You will not shame this family. You will, you will not do these things. And this is a form of shame that I experienced a lot as a child. My maiden name was Crawford. And so what I would hear growing up is, that is not how Crawfords act. And so anytime I did something that didn't meet the expectation of the Crawford name, I would hear that. And so I grew up knowing, there are very specific ways I'm supposed to act, and there are ways that I'm not supposed to act. And sometimes the ways that I was supposed to act didn't really align with who I was as a person. And if I didn't do them, I experienced shame. So there's a couple, from the anxiety and depression perspective, there's a couple places where we see shame really play a part here. And one is that for a lot of us in our families, I know that I'm multiracial. My dad's side of the family is Black and not immigrants, American. And we didn't talk about mental health. We did not talk about mental health at all. And you didn't have anxiety, you just had nerves. That was something. We didn't have depression, you just got sad every now and then. And that, if anybody in her family had gone to get help for their mental health, that would have been a very, very shameful thing for somebody to do. My family was Black Baptist. And so we went to church And, Jesus was the answer for all of your anxiety. You just had to pray for everything and pray everything away. And while that was church was a source of comfort and a source of connection, at the same time, we had family members that wasn't enough. And so they were really suffering in silence because of the shame that was associated with not being able to come out and say, hey, I have depression, or hey, I have anxiety. So we see that's a really common example that I see around anxiety and depression.
Okay, so Lee, I love the examples you're bringing to the table here, especially talking about kids, right? Because I was taking a course, and one of the key topics was about mental health problems with children. And you've just been talking about what we see with our children, especially from a different culture. You have first generation immigrants raised in another world, different style of discipline, with the shame and everything. And then we migrate here. We have our children go to schools, they're exposed to another culture. Yes. They try to fit in, but they don't really fit in well. But all we think about is that shame that they will bring back to the family, right? If you're not going to Harvard, then you're some sort of a disappointment. And the children that go to Harvard are celebrated so much so that the children that go to the community colleges feel like they disappointed their parents to an extent, right? Or if you're not a doctor, if you're not studying law, or, we tend to limit our children in the ways they think and act, because it ties back to that whole shame and how things are supposed to be. Yeah. From our perspectives as parents. So my question to you will be, how can we as parents also understand, and what can we do? Because it's challenging and it's mostly unintentional. We don't intend to raise our children that way. That's the only way we know how, right? So how can we find middle ground?
So I'm really glad that you're asking this, because sometimes when I give these talks, I feel like as a parent, I'm like, if I was listening to this, I would just be slowly sinking in my seat going, oh my gosh. And the thing of it is that, number one, you get to give yourself some compassion here, because you did not just, the way you're parenting your child is oftentimes very, very based in how you were parented. And so this is something what we refer to as generational trauma. And this is where things get passed down. Interestingly enough, both through our DNA, through our genetics, we pass it down, and then also through our behavior and how we connect with each other. And so there's actually two ways that this happens. And one of the stats that I think is kind of depressing and also hopeful is that it takes, if we have used shame as the primary parenting tool, it takes about 6 generations for that of each person going down those generations to stop using shame in order for it to fully leave our DNA, in order for it to leave our genes. And so part of this is that we get to give ourselves a lot of compassion and be kind to ourselves, because some of this is just inherently within us. The other piece is that I haven't met a lot of parents who use shame as a way to parent their children who also don't shame themselves. So here's an example of what shaming yourself looks like. Shaming yourself looks like, or internalized shame is what we call it. This is where, case in point, I was out with my husband the other day, and I said something really silly that wasn't right. And I got really upset, and I was like, oh my gosh, I told you that, and that's not right. Like, I was wrong. I was mistaken. And he said, he's like, you're getting so upset. Why are you getting so upset? I said, because that was such a stupid thing for me to do. And he stopped and he said, why are you calling yourself stupid? And I said, I don't know. And what I realized is that is something that I internalized after hearing it when I was a kiddo. And so, my caregivers, my elders aren't around anymore to even say that to me, but it's in my head. I heard it. And so a lot of times when parents are using shame as a parenting technique, it's because they're also self-parenting themselves that way. That's how you keep yourself in line. That's how you keep yourself doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so part of this is really examining, where am I using shame against myself? And where maybe do I want to choose to do something differently? Do I want to be nicer to myself, kinder to myself? And then from there, how can I start being using this attunement skill with my kids? So really this is, and I also want to say this, attunement is a very simple skill. It's a very simple practice. So noticing when somebody does something that they're upset about or I'm upset about, and getting myself back to like a calm state, not feeling anxious or not feeling really, really sad, upset, just coming back to like okay. And then giving this person acceptance. That's simple. And it is the hardest thing to do. It is it's really hard when your child has done something that feels, and here's why, because when our children do something that we feel like an urge to shame them over, it's because what they've done feels dangerous to us. It feels dangerous, right? Our child not getting into Harvard feels dangerous. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but our child not getting into Harvard, if we've had it drilled into us that education is the way we survive, that every generation does a little bit better and a little bit better, and that's how we collectively grow and survive. Your child not getting into Harvard is dangerous. So us understanding, wow, I'm actually trying to protect my child here and protect my family here. And me shaming them around this is not going to have the effect that I want it to. So coming back and just practicing that attunement over and over and over, it's something that just like slowly chips away at the shame. And also we see the mental health of our kids get better categorically as we start to parent them that way. And we start having better mental health as well, because we're not being mean to ourselves all of the time.
Awesome. So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about some of the prevalent issues in our community that actually drive the shame aspect of things, right? Like separation from marriage, like divorces, right? Some people stick it in there, they stay in terrible, horrible marriages because there's always that little voice that tells you, if I leave, that will be shame to my family. So they have to stay there. Yeah. But then what you're telling me is that part of that is also an unintentional way of putting our children through depression and trauma, because the fear of shaming ourselves is putting them in harm's way, that putting them in another level of shame. Or am I just understanding this wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of research that shows that children growing up in an environment where they feel safe, where they feel like they belong, and where they feel like they can be themselves, right? Where they can be vulnerable and share the things that they like and share the things that they don't like. And trust that even if you don't agree with them, you're not going to judge them. You might judge their behavior. You're not going to judge them. And there's a distinction there, right? There's a difference between, hey, that thing you did, that was not the smartest thing. And you're not smart. One is a character and one is a behavior. And so if we can separate the behavior from the character, and as parents talk to our kids about, hey, I love you, and you will always be my child, and also that was not the smartest move. That's a difference. And so same thing for us when we think about the relationships we stay in, right? It's really helpful for our kids to see the modeling of, you know what? This was not the best idea for me to marry this person. This was not the best idea for me to enter into this relationship. And I care about myself enough that I'm allowed to make a different choice now, because I'm not going to punish myself for making this bad choice, because I'm not a bad person. It was a bad choice. And so as our kids see that, they go, oh, okay, well, that means that if I get into a relationship like this, I can leave because mom or dad or somebody showed me that that was okay.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Like we could say, you mentioned earlier that you could spend 45 hours talking about this topic, because it's a very important topic that we need to normalize, right? Talking about anxiety, depression, and trauma. But what are some of the signs and symptoms that we as people should look out for, so that people don't have to tell you, but you can spot from their behavior? In order to be able to support, we have to be aware of some of those signs to spot, right? What are some of those?
Okay, so instead of thinking about this in terms of depression and anxiety and PTSD or post-traumatic stress, I want to make this really simple. What we're going to look for is we're going to look at people's body language. We're going to listen to the words that they're using. And we're going to pay attention to basically what's going on with them, okay? So when we see humans develop depression and humans develop anxiety, humans who develop, and some people have both, we see a difference in how they show up in front of other people, especially people that they trust, where sometimes the mask can slip a little bit. So if I see somebody who is having what we refer to as constrictive or avoidance symptoms, and what this means is that they are intentionally avoiding certain activities or people or places, or whenever they have to go interact in those places or with those people, they're really tense or they're really sad, right? If I see people start to withdraw and avoid, either they're really amped up and nervous about it, or they're just like, no, I don't want to go do that. I don't. That's a noticing for us, especially with kids. If we have a kid who's loved something for a really long time, and all of a sudden, it's not like, I just kind of grew out of that. It's one day it's there and one day it's not. Something has happened. Something has happened around that. And so we want to watch for that. And it's not just with kids. This happens with adults too, but especially with kids. So if we see avoidant symptoms, the other thing we want to look for is something called intrusive symptoms. And this is where people start having, if you think of an intruder, like it's something that enters in without permission, this is where our kids are having nightmares, where they are acting out. You used that term before. If I have a kid who was not acting out, who is suddenly acting out, something's happened. Because that is their body trying to tell us, I'm not okay. So physical reactivity, if people get really jumpy, if we start to notice that somebody is more irritable or more aggressive, if we notice, again, especially with kids, but not just kids, more risky or destructive behavior. So people start doing, teenagers, they start, experimenting with alcohol or drugs. They, from a sexual practices, like start doing things that are more risky, things like that. From the depression side, a lot of times we'll see difficulty sleeping or sleeping a lot. So I'm in bed all the time. I'm not changing my clothes. I'm not showering. I'm not putting as much care into my physical appearance. I have a really hard time concentrating, is something we'll see as well. And one of the things that I see in kids also is you'll see something called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is the kid that has you come check in their room 16 times to see if there's a monster under the bed. Or the kid that keeps coming into your room at night. It's like, I can't sleep. And you're like, why? They're like, I don't know. I just can't sleep. A lot of times at nighttime, we see this with kiddos and with adults too, but particularly kiddos, because that's when they're alone and they're scared. So changes in arousal around how tense they are or how kind of withdrawn and sad, like flat emotions they have. And then the last piece of this is, how long has this been going on, right? I have a kiddo who had nightmares for, a week straight, and then they stopped. And so that probably not a thing. We just watched a scary YouTube video and we had to let that run its course. Yes. But that did feel traumatic, but it was only for a week. So we wouldn't really call that a trauma. If I have a kid that's having nightmares for 3 months, that's not sleeping, that's bedwetting, especially when they weren't doing that before, that's a time to kind of key into something's going on there. So longer than a month. And then the other piece of this is it impairing their daily life? And sometimes what we see is that the impairment of daily life isn't coming from the symptoms as much as it's coming from what people are doing to try to feel better around the symptoms. So this is sleeping and missing work because I can't get out of bed. This is alcohol. Alcohol is the most well-tolerated numbing tool we have in the world. It is the only socially acceptable tool that we can use to suppress how we are feeling. Everything else is pretty, isn't as socially accepted, but alcohol is a very socially accepted way of not feeling your feelings. And then the last piece here is really paying attention to people's moods. So are they having a lot of negative thoughts? Are they starting to say some mean things about themselves? Or are they getting really angry at other people? Are you seeing them, again, withdraw from activities they really like? Are you noticing that they're isolating themselves? Maybe they had 5 friends that they talked to before, and now you're noticing they're not calling anybody or nobody's texting them. And then even when good things happen, they're either worried or they're not, it doesn't change their mood. They're like, meh, it is what it is.
Dr. Lee, I have a question, and I
Yeah.
think there's someone in the chat with
Yeah.
the question, but about friendships.
Yeah.
I'm asking this question because I went through an episode and you mentioned something about sleep. Now, everybody knows that I sleep a lot. This is from back in the day from school, right? I don't know if it was depression or not, but I still enjoy my sleep to this day. But when I lost a close family member, I had to educate myself about depression, and that helped me because, again, my behavior did not really change. Everybody knows I sleep, but the sleep was different. It was the kind of sleep that I just never wanted to wake up.
Yeah.
I felt like I should just sleep life away, just sleep through life. But then I was forced to wake up because I had to work. You have children, you have a husband that you have to care for. And you would mask it sometimes because you want to appear normal. Then your friends may not connect or relate. It will be hard for them to spot, to the extent where you can have relationship problems with your friends. Yes. Because you're not the usual spunky you anymore. You're trying so hard, but it's impossible. So what can you tell us as we interact with our friends, whether it be a disappearing act from a friend that you don't see for so long? How can you slowly but steadily get to them to the point where maybe they can allow some space for you to help them?
So thank you for sharing your story, being vulnerable about that, because I think that a lot of people experience this. And here's one thing that I think this really shifted something for me, because up until I heard this, I a lot of times would shame myself for how I dealt with grief. And there's a difference between, let me say it this way, not all grief is trauma. All trauma is grief. There's going to be grief with all trauma that we experience, but not all grief is traumatic. Sometimes it's something that we're able to move through and it doesn't negatively affect how we see the world or how we see other people. But what you're describing is grief. And grief is a normal human emotion. We're supposed to experience grief. That's what we have when we lose something that we care about. And what one of my mentors told me was this: when you experience a loss, a deep loss like you just described, and you are going through grief for 1 year, anything that you do to get through that grief that does not actively hurt yourself or someone else is good. So if that means you're sleeping 16 hours, getting up, going to work, coming back home, getting in bed, if that is how you are moving through it, fine. When that becomes not fine is when it's not helping you heal. It's when you're not eating. It's when you're missing work. It's when it starts to impair and negatively impact you. And so from a friend perspective, and it's the music video that Marie played the song at the beginning. If you have strong friends, it's always the strong friends, right? It's just the friends that seem like they're fine and then all of a sudden they're not there. A lot of times we forget to check on them. Attunement is also you reaching out and saying, hey, I know you might not want to talk. I know that you might not want to, I know that you're going through some really hard things. I'm willing to come and sit on the couch with you and not say anything for 2 hours. I'm willing to go grab groceries for you. I'm willing to do whatever. And if and when you are ready to talk about this, or if and when you desire support around this, I'm here. And sometimes it's just the knowing that somebody else has noticed. And it's also the knowing that somebody else cares. And notice what I said there. I didn't say, what can I do to help? Because if you have just experienced trauma or you've experienced a loss, I know this personally, and I'm curious about you. If somebody had said, what can I do to help? The answer is normally, I don't know. I don't know that there is anything that you can do to help. But if you said to me, I'm going to come over, and what day this week do you want me there? Okay, when I come over, I'm bringing food. Let me know if there's anything you don't want. And thinking about this with our kids who are maybe going through something, hey, I've noticed that your behavior's changed a little bit. And if you don't want to talk to me about it, that's okay. And I'm here for you. And know that nothing you tell me is going to make me love you any less.
I like that.
Right? I'm not, one of my other favorite things that a lot of us are afraid to tell people when we're having these things because we're afraid people will get upset. We're afraid that we'll get shamed. And one of my favorite things that I say to my kids is, I'm not going to promise that I won't be mad. I will promise that I won't be mean.
Okay, what does that mean now? Mad and mean. Please explain.
Right? I might have anger. I might feel anger in my body. I'm not going to direct it at you. So you may tell me something that I really don't like, right? That really does not feel good for me to hear. And I may experience anger or sadness or frustration or disappointment. And what I'm not going to do is turn that back to you and say, oh my gosh, how could you do that? That was the worst thing you could have done. And like you've brought shame on the family and you've done, no, I'm not going to do that. I might walk away from you for a hot minute. I might say, okay, I'm going to go over there. I love you. I'm going to go over there. I'll be back. But I'm not going to process what I'm feeling on you, because that is where the damage gets done.
So would it be very damaging? And this is something I'm sure the audience, we experience this a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your child tells you this, and they're bold and brave enough to tell you something bad that they've done, either in school or with their friends at a party or something. And rather than give this response, you're saying, hi, my God, I cannot handle this. Okay, let me call. Monet, you know, and just imagine, you cannot imagine what my daughter just told me. Yeah. And then Monet says, hold on. Monet connects another friend. We're now on a three-way. We're going through this child's life, right? Dissecting every bit of what they did wrong, but not really coming back to the child to share the words of, I love you, I'll be there for you. We're now just blowing the whole situation to an even bigger portion than it really was. Yeah. How do you think that leaves the child? What is the child thinking of feeling at that time? What do you think could be going on here?
Yeah, it does feel really shaming, right? Because it's okay, well, if I come to my parent and tell them about this issue or this problem that I'm having or this mistake that I made, everyone's going to know about it. So it's that unwanted attention. You know, another way I see this is the phone call gets made in front of the child. And I actually used to do this. So if anybody's done this before, again, we're not shaming ourselves or anyone else in this conversation, because you are not the only person to have ever done this. You're not the last person on this. Yes, we're learning, you know, and I didn't realize this was a shaming behavior, but our oldest is the child that was sent to teach me a lot of things about myself. Out of the three, I have learned the most about myself from my oldest. And my oldest, you know, used to do things that I just did not understand. And I would go to my husband while my oldest was in the other room, and I would be like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that they just did this. And like, what are they thinking? But my child can hear me. So I'm having a conversation about them that is not kind, that they can hear, but they're not involved. And so we started something different. And this is something that is a big shift for a lot of families. And we've seen a lot of really positive successes. We do not talk negatively about someone unless they are in the room. And what I mean by that is, I'm not going to, if we're going to be discussing the negative pieces of your behavior, you get to be there to be part of the conversation. So if my child does something and my husband comes home, I say, hey, come over, we're going to have a talk with dad. And I say, okay, this is what happened. And so my child is there to be like, to hear what I'm saying. And that makes a huge difference, because they can actually then chime in sometimes and go, oh, mom, like, that's not what I meant. I meant this. And then it becomes this really beautiful conversation. And also they know that I'm not using judgmental or shaming language. I'm just saying, this is what happened. Are you okay if I answer Beatrice's questions?
Yes, I was going to actually say, maybe we can pause and just answer questions either from the chat or from the audience, right? Before we go to the last question. Yeah. So it's open for questions. Marie, do you have, I can't see Beatrice's questions.
I can see them if that's okay.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the first question, can these mental health situations be cured? Yes. And I want to be careful around the word cured, because what matters here is if this is myself or someone else, my child is experiencing anxiety or depression because of a traumatic thing they went through, versus my child or this person or myself has a biological genetic hardwiring to be more anxious or depressed. So it's really important, because some of us, you know, we have 6 generations of depression on one side of my family, and 4 generations of bipolar on the other side of the family. So even if I didn't have any traumatic experiences in my life, which I did very young, even if I hadn't had those, I would still likely have some depression because genetically it's there. So some people can absolutely heal and release these symptoms, and other people, they're still going to need support, whether that's through medicine or through counseling or through just, support groups or whatever you've got out there, or whatever resources you decide to use. So the answer is yes and no. And what I actually think is really cool about trauma, and it's honestly why I left healthcare and do this now, is because if we can figure out the events that led to the anxiety and depression, there are ways of processing that with trauma therapists or with trauma specialists that help you release it. And it's wild. It's phenomenal how quickly that can happen. So yes, to that question, kind of yes and no answer. So let me know if you'd like any clarification on that. And then your other question was, rejection is increasingly pushing young girls to suicide. Yeah, how can rejection be managed? So again, there is a difference between I don't want to live like this and I want to die. And this is a conversation I have with my clients a lot when they tell me, I've had suicidal thoughts in the past. I say, do you not want to live like this, or do you not want to be alive? Because those are 2 different things. And most of these girls or these young adults that are committing suicide, it's not that they want to die, it's that they don't want to continue to live like this, and they don't know that there's a way to stop feeling like this. So one of the big pieces here is helping these kids and these young adults understand that you can feel better, that this is something that we can do something about. And a big piece of this is these girls or these young adults have to feel safe enough to tell somebody what's going on. And so this is where that shame-free piece comes in, because if my child doesn't feel safe enough coming to me and saying, Mom, all of my friends rejected me and they dropped my lunch tray in my lap at lunch, and I had to walk around covered in food for the rest of the day. And now I have this nickname and there's these things going on. I was bullied significantly twice in middle school and in high school. And if it weren't for my parents really being supportive and going, you know what, we will sort this out. We will shift schools. We will do whatever we need to do in order to be able to help you through this. Without that support, I don't know that I would have made it through, honestly. And so that's where, making sure that these teens and these young adults have a place they can go where they don't feel isolated is huge.
Any other questions?
Is it Makuba? Great present. Thank you. What resources do you have for bipolar depression? So bipolar, it's fascinating. What we are starting to do, and it's slow going, but a lot of the mental health community, when we have people come in who we think might have bipolar or schizophrenia, or they have a substance use disorder, they are addicted to alcohol or another drug, if they have some really, I didn't mention this, but a really big sign of trauma in young girls is eating disorders. So if you notice that your child suddenly changes how they're eating, there's a really strong correlation between eating disorders and trauma. that especially sexual trauma. So just putting that out there. But one of the things that we're finding with bipolar is, and as we're shifting how we're looking at these things from a mental health perspective, we're actually doing trauma surveys now when people come in with psychosis or with schizophrenia or with bipolar like symptoms, because what we're finding is that a lot of these people, their symptoms are due to the fact that there was some significant childhood trauma. And so if we can support people in healing and processing all of the things, the bad things that happened to them when they were younger, a lot of the symptoms go away. And again, not always, but from a bipolar depression standpoint, Makuba, it's going to depend on where you're located. I can share with Lizzie and Marie afterwards a few really good resources. And if you're looking for a provider and you're here in the United States, if you go to the American Psychological Association's website, you can actually search for providers on there, and you can look for from a specific diagnosis perspective. So people who are trained in helping people with trauma or bipolar or whatever disorder.
I seem to see more questions coming.
Yeah. Do you mind if I just keep, is it okay?
Just keep going. That's why we're here. Dr. Lee, that's why we're here.
Yeah. This is how I run when we teach at the Institute. So I was like, this is actually very comfortable for me. What tips can you offer for cultural differences in depression? Yeah. So really, I think I guess I would want a little bit more clarification from you, because what I'm understanding around this, and I could be wrong, is is this a question about like, how do you deal with the stigma of depression from a cultural perspective, or how depression shows up different in different cultures? What exactly are you asking? So I can answer you.
That question came from Makuba, right? Makuba, can you unmute yourself and just explain? I see a follow-up that says cultural differences in depression.
Okay, so if you're talking about like how often we see it, or are certain cultures more likely to be depressed versus others, what we know is that humans who feel strongly connected and who, oh, you're fine, Makuba. Humans who feel strongly connected to other people and who feel like they can express their feelings and again, be themselves, we do see lower rates of depression. So in cultures, so here's the other piece, is that some cultures, if you say, do you have depression? They'll say no. Even though if we had them fill out the form for how you would diagnose depression, they would have depression. They could be diagnosed with depression. So some of it is, how much is it recognized as a valid diagnosis in that culture? How much is it socially acceptable or how socially acceptable is it to say that you have depression or not? And also, what does the community look like? What does the community look like? If somebody is struggling with something, how safe do they feel going to a person or to the community as a whole and telling them, and how lovingly and supportingly does the community respond to that person sharing how they're feeling? So a big thing I see is, and we didn't talk about it, but the pandemic and the level of isolation that was created during the pandemic for, from a legal and a practical perspective, the reason why our depression rates in the United States went up so much, they went from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3, which is for anxiety and depression, which is a really high rate for a population, for 1 in 3 people to say that they have depression or anxiety. It is my opinion, I'll say it as an opinion, that a lot of that was due to the isolation of, I can't physically touch people. I'm not allowed to hug people. I'm not, if I go see my grandparents, I might hurt them. I could catch something from them. There was a lot of isolation around that. And we actually know that as humans, we need physical touch and we need to be socially connected with others in order to really survive and thrive. That's how that's one of our needs as humans. So the pandemic really, in specific cultures where, community is really important, us staying together is really important. And all of a sudden we're all in our own homes. We're not seeing each other. We're not having that connection. That can really change, how much depression and anxiety we see as well. So let me know if that didn't answer your question, please let me know. I'm happy to try again. Oh, Lizzie, I think you're.
I have to, yeah. There's a raised hand from
Oh, yeah.
Nana Philo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for all the explanations. Now, I have a very, basic but tricky question.
Sure.
When we have, here in Africa, we're fond of suffering from malaria, for example. So what can be the first aid for depression or anxiety or PTSD? Like, what do you think one can do the minute you feel like, okay, I feel like this is depression coming, I feel like I'm not feeling myself, I feel like if I let this get a hold of me, I might not go through, what's the first thing you think one can do in such a situation? Thank you.
Yes, this is a fabulous question. And actually, it leads to the last point we were going to talk about, if I can tie them together, around how do we as individuals and as communities really recover or, prevent anxiety and depression. And one of the biggest things that we discount is safety. So a lot of times when people experience depression or anxiety and we start to feel those symptoms coming on, it's typically because some part of our life has changed in a way that it's negatively affected our safety, either our emotional safety or our physical safety or our spiritual safety. And what I mean by safety is again, like our certainty that we are going to be okay. So when we notice these symptoms coming on, one of the very first things that I will talk to people about is, do you have from a basic needs perspective, do you feel safe sleeping where you're sleeping? Do you feel like, do you have enough food? Do you have enough water? Do you have do you have someone you can talk to? Do you have a safe place where if you need to cry for a minute or you need to, beat your fists against the floor, you're able to do that? Do you have a safe place to feel your feelings? And so for a lot of us, we think, oh, okay, I'm having these anxiety and depression symptoms start to come on, or I'm having some PTSD, some post-traumatic stress. Let me try to get my mind right again. And we really have to start at that lower body level of, if I'm living in a house with somebody who threatens me or occasionally hurts me, it's going to be really, really hard for me to emotionally heal or get better if my physical safety is at risk on a daily basis. So the first place to focus is on those really basic needs of, do I have safe shelter? Do I have access to the food and the water that I need? And do I, the humans that are in my space, do I feel safe living with them? And then from there, that's where, once those things are in place, that's where we can start looking at actually shifting your emotional state or your mental state.
no, what if all of those are not physical, but they're more psychological?
Okay.
Do you stay there? Because there is this say that goes, you can stay in the same environment, like you can heal in the same environment that made you sick, something of that sort.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, should you stay there and develop other strategies to heal, or do you leave and heal and come back to the same trauma? Or I don't know. I
Yeah.
really need
That's a great question. It's a great question. And the answer is, it depends. It depends. So sometimes, yes, I have seen plenty of people heal their trauma without changing their physical location or changing the relationships that they are involved in. And if you are going to stay in the same place, you have to be able to set different boundaries. And if you can't set different boundaries, and what I mean by boundaries are, if you cannot express your needs and have them be honored by the people you are in relationship with. So an example of this would be, I've had lots of relationships where I've set boundaries, and an example would be, hey, I am no longer willing to have a conversation about this topic because this topic feels really, really upsetting to me. So if you decide you'd like to keep talking about this, I'm not going to come over anymore. I'm not going to call you. I'm not going to hang out with you. Basically, I'm going to create some separation between us because this is not a healthy way for me to relate to you anymore. And if that can be honored, then yes, you can stay there and you can do the healing that you need to do. If you are, one of the reasons I left the hospital and left the job that I was in was because it was incredibly traumatic, and there was no negotiating or boundary moving that could happen, right? I couldn't go to my boss and say, hey, I can't work 19-hour shifts anymore. They were like, this is your schedule. These are the shifts. So that was a place where I had to leave because there was no wiggle room in there. There was no adjusting. So if you're able to adjust things so that you can have more space or more time, or maybe it's, hey, I'm going to be crying a lot more because I'm trying to actually feel my feelings. And so if somebody's going to be mean to you every time you cry, you're probably going to have a hard time healing in that space. So if you can, if your needs are going to be respected or they can be negotiated in that space, yes, stay. If they can't, then that might be a relationship or a place that you need to distance yourself from for a little while, at least until you've gone through the healing process.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Are there any other questions in the chat, Marie? Otherwise, I have one question that came through my inbox. So someone is asking, go ahead. Someone say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Lee, for the presentation. It's amazing. I wanted to follow up to the question of cultural differences. So many of the things that you're talking about, we see them in the West. I don't know if that is actually happening in our societies back in Africa, where I am currently, though I understand how the West works. So what I'm asking is, in school, when we're growing up in school and when we're in secondary, primary school, I don't know if we ever talked about bullying or things like that. Those were not our vocabularies, things that we normally used. And even in our society where we are, we hardly see people saying people are dying from depression. Is it because it's not being diagnosed? Or is it because it's something that we don't know? Or how is it? Or is it because we have more resilience? I don't understand. Is there something you can say to that?
That's a really great, yes, thank you. So was that Jackson?
Yes, please, okay. Jackson, from
Senegal. Oh, fabulous. Yeah, so it could be all three, honestly. So what it could be is that the way in which your community is structured is that as kids, you feel safe having these experiences, talking to your family. The other piece is that sometimes there's less trauma in specific communities. So if I'm in a community where, our resources we have the resources we need, there's not any threat from another country or war or anything like that. I don't have any experiences where as a child I'm feeling shamed or excluded, then there very well could be less anxiety and depression in that space because it's a relatively healthy community. The other thing though I would say is that a lot of this is when you think about how do I want to say this? When fish are born in the ocean, right? They're in water and they don't know they're in water. They're just in water, right? They're born in water. And if you took a fish out and all of a sudden it's going to go, there's something other than water. I'm in air. I can't breathe, right? But the reality is going to shift for that fish very quickly because all of a sudden it's going to realize that water is not the only thing. Now, imagine a fish being born in or living in a really, really dirty, nasty, like you can't see around it. There's trash and pollution in the water. And all of a sudden that fish then gets into clear, clean, blue, visible water. That fish is all of a sudden going to realize, wow, I didn't know that what I grew up in was that bad. And now that I have this experience over here, oh, okay, this is how things could have been. And so sometimes it's, and not to say that's your experience here, but sometimes when I hear this a lot from people is they say, oh, I didn't have anxiety. I didn't have depression. I didn't have any incidences of trauma. And then as we're going through things were so normal for them. They saw that so much that it didn't seem like it was wrong. And then when they learn, oh, other people don't experience that. That is not a norm across the world. Then all of a sudden our reality shifts. So it also goes to what Makuba is saying here. The social determinants of health in Africa are quite different than the West. Yes, absolutely. So if there's no cultural understanding or cultural definition of depression, then I might not recognize my symptoms as depression until I get into a place where they say, hey, are you experiencing this and this and this and this and this? And I go, oh, yes, I've experienced that. And they say, this is depression. So that is why I say it's helpful for us to not go off of the terms and instead look at the symptoms. Is that me?
No, it's not.
Okay. Instead to look at the symptoms, and because some areas in the world have really low rates of depression and anxiety, and it's because it's not measured. Some places in the world have really low rates of depression and anxiety, and it's because their communities are more connected and less shameful. Some places in the world have really high rates of depression and anxiety, and it's because, I'm just talking about America here, because it is beneficial from a healthcare perspective and from a payment perspective and an insurance perspective to have more diagnoses, because that's how our healthcare system is set up. So it's really going to depend.
Interesting.
Dr.
Wow.
Lee, I'm Rose. I'm calling from Canada. I just want to chime in a little bit in the cultural differences aspect. The eras too have changed. We're living a different era, and things are changing by the day, by the time. Back home, we have more of a connected and supportive society where you will hardly find, say, for example, children are coming back from school and an adult is going by and see one of the children being shamed. That adult is going to act up without the parents of the other children even coming to say a word. So that is how the community is connected. Another point is, because we live in this part of the world, especially those of us that immigrated here, we have given birth to our children. The way we raise them here is different from the way we were raised. We were raised with more resilience than what we're going to give our children here. So you have to look into that aspect as well. And looking into that aspect, it makes you sit back and say, oh, no. There is more for me, more attention to be given to my child born here. There is more for me to look into, because in this part of the world, there is, as we grow, as we get older, as things change, there is less and less and less, how do I put it, trust in your environment. So the trust in your environment is, even back home, the way I lived back home, I don't think other children live like that right now, because the trust is gradually seeping off. So I think if we look at it that way, we can say, okay, there is resilience, yes, there is a support system, yes, but times are changing.
I thank you so much for sharing that, Rose, because you brought in a really key point here. In the West, if we go back, actually, if we look at the entire world and we go back several hundred years, children for every one child, there used to be 4 to 5 caregivers that child would interact with on a very consistent basis, sometimes more.
Correct.
So there was a communal aspect to raising our children. And it's just like you said, back home, if we see something happening with kids, we're going to step in, even if we don't know their parents or have permission to say, hey, we don't do that, right? Here in America, or in the, in the North America, I'll say specifically, that is something that could get you in. I mean, we don't parent other people's kids, especially if we do not know their parents, because of the level of danger around that. And from a legal perspective, that could be, it's not socially acceptable to do that. And so now, when we fast forwarded several hundred years to today, the average child it's something like 1.2 caregivers that they have. So for every 2 adults, there's 5 children that are being looked after by those 2 adults alone. That is how much the tables have flipped, and how much more we live as an individualistic, nuclear family dynamic here. And that is a big place that we're seeing issues with depression and anxiety, because we are, especially from a child perspective, we've lost so many of the connections. And when you think about this from a trauma perspective, if mom is the sole caregiver and my relationship with her is not good, that's the only relationship I potentially have. Versus if I live in a multi-generational home or a community where there are 6, 8, 10 caregivers, maybe I don't like 4 of them, but there's 4 others that I can go to when I need something. There are 4 others that if I have an issue, I can't hear you anymore, Dr. Lee. Oh, you can't hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay. There's, I have other adults I can go to. I have other people that I know won't shame me around this, that I can get advice from, that I can share my feelings with, that I can do this. And so what you brought in is so crucial. And it's a big part of how many resources does this child have, that if I have a need, okay, well, I can't go to this person and I can't go to this person, but I can go to this person. And it's the ability to have one person that you can go to and feel safe going to from a psychological perspective that makes all the difference.
And let me also add, Dr. Lee, that we're starting to see a shift in behavior, even in Africa or Cameroon, where we come from. There's the internet, there's social media, right?
Yes.
So now we see young people committing suicide, maybe because they broke up with their boyfriends, something we just never imagined growing up. So that shift in what's happening in the West is slowly going, transitioning in Africa. And I'm not sure, I could be very wrong. I'm thinking we experienced those things, but never really expressed them. But the young people nowadays, wherever they are, they're starting to see that they can also express and they can also act out. They can commit suicide and get out of a situation that they have no control over.
Yeah.
So I wanted to drop that there before I ask one question from Cameroon.
Yeah.
Someone is asking, should my depression be treated with medication? Should I let my friends and family know that I'm depressed?
So this is the line I say before I go here every time is, I am a nurse practitioner. I am not your nurse practitioner. So this is not personalized advice. If your medication can be a really, really great start and stabilization point for a lot of people. I will be totally vulnerable with y'all. I started an antidepressant when I was 9. I went off of it for several years. I went back on. I don't believe I'll ever go back off of it again. I'm on a low dose. It makes a huge difference for me. And I've experienced it both ways. And something that one of my therapists along the way told me that was really helpful is, she reminded me of that genetic piece. And she said, you've done all the work. You spent years working through your trauma. You've processed and you've released all of this. And so the fact that you still have symptoms, yes, you get to have meds. And so medication can be really helpful in the initial stage while we're figuring out what is going on. And then if we either figure out that there isn't any trauma that needs worked through, or there is trauma that needs healed and processed, and you do that work and you're still symptomatic, you get to stay on those medications. And it is a very personal choice, and it is one that I think gets stigmatized a lot. And I know Marie, I see Marie nodding as a part. Yeah, it gets stigmatized a lot. And I am of the mind of, if it helps, it helps. And I go back to that question of, if it's not harming me and it's not harming anyone else and it's helping me, then I get to use it as a tool. So yes, around the meds. And then there was a second piece, right? Oh, tell friends and family.
Yeah, should she tell them?
Yeah.
Now that's the shame factor. That's the shame part.
And that right there, I think you get to tell who feels safe to you. I think you get to practice telling the person that you feel the safest with. And, if it feels scary or it feels shameful for you to tell somebody, then start with one person, right? We just need that one person. And so sometimes it's helpful to even tell somebody that we don't know that well, that we know will keep that confidential, and just practice saying it out loud if we feel like there's going to be some shame to it, and kind of build up that confidence around, no, this is something that I'm allowed to share. So and by the way, should is a shame word. So should indicates shame, right? You should do this, or you shouldn't do this, or because the other half of that sentence is or else, right? So instead of saying if you should or you shouldn't, I want to turn that back to you and ask you, do you want to? And what would be the benefit for you to do that? And if so, who do you want to tell?
So I'm a little confused here. I just need you to clarify.
Yeah, please.
You're not telling someone I have depression because no one has diagnosed you, right? But you're sharing the symptoms.
Yeah.
You're saying, hey, lately I've not been feeling like myself. I don't want to go out anymore. I don't want to talk to people anymore. I just want to stay in the basement. Or is that what you should be sharing if you want to share?
Yeah.
Or you're going to say, oh, I have depression.
Yeah. So I recommend, I'm not going to say the word recommend. If it were me, I don't use diagnostic words unless I've gotten a diagnosis. So I wouldn't say I have depression. And I'm going to invite you all to hear this language shift, because this is something I say to my the humans who come through our institute. You are not depressed. You have depression. You are not an anxious person. You have anxiety. And the reason we say it that way is because if I say I'm depressed or I'm anxious, that becomes part of my identity, right? It's the same as saying I'm blonde or I have brown eyes or I'm a brunette, or it's part of my identity. Versus saying I have anxiety, that's okay. There are, I have some physical symptoms that come up sometimes that I feel more worried or I feel anxious about things, but that's not who I am. That's just something I'm experiencing. And it's a lot easier to shift feelings of anxiety and depression when we see them as experiences instead of as part of who we are. So, if you are having those feelings and you don't have a diagnosis, you can say, I'm feeling depressed. I'm having some symptoms of depression. This is what's going on with me. If you actually have that diagnosis, yeah, you get to say, yeah, I've been diagnosed with depression. I have major depressive disorder. But until you have that diagnosis, sticking with the feelings is a good route to go.
Dr. Lee, we're at 5:30. I know you're on vacation. Everyone, when I reached out to Dr. Lee, she did not hesitate to do this because she feels like this is a conversation that needs to happen over and over and over. Parents need to know these things, especially immigrant parents like us, right? And if you were not here for her intro, Dr. Lee is an expert mind coach. She's a certified clinical trauma professional, CEO and founder of the Institute of Trauma and Psychological Safety. I have one question, which is the biggest question of all, right? We've talked about what anxiety, trauma, and depression are. What are the symptoms? What shame has to do with all of this from a cultural perspective. Now, what's really important, and I would like for us to know, is how do we as a community come together and support each other to the point where people may feel safe enough in the Western world to share or maybe acknowledge that what they're feeling is not normal and they can get the help that they need.
Yeah.
How can we support?
Okay, so 3 things. 1, if anybody tells you that they are having these feelings, one of the best things you can say is, thank you so much for telling me. Thank you so much for being brave enough to share that with me, right? Because what we're doing is we're normalizing that this is something that it's safe for them to share, right? So that's a big thing. Number 2 is we get to have conversations. My husband just came back. We get to have conversations kind of proactively, right? So I am a big fan of the car conversation when it comes to my kids. So I'm driving somewhere, we're going to baseball practice, we're doing those things, and I'll say, hey, has anybody talked to you about anxiety? And they'll say, well, what do you mean, right? And say, well, I'm just curious because, I learned about this. Great thing. I watched this thing this weekend and I was learning about this, and I learned a lot about anxiety and depression that I didn't know. And I don't know, have you ever learned about it? And you get to start a conversation. So we're normalizing the fact that this is something that is safe for us to talk about. And the third thing is that you keep doing this. You keep having communal conversations where you normalize the fact that as humans, we're going to have grief and we're going to have trauma and we're going to have feelings of and experiences of anxiety and depression. And some of us are going to get diagnosed with that long term. And that does not affect your worth or your value or how much you are loved in the community that you're in. And so the more we see people talk about it, the more we go, oh, it's okay for me to feel this way. And I don't have to feel shame or embarrassment around it.
What's the message to parents who have children going through depression and they know it, they've been diagnosed, but yet they're finding it very difficult to either accept it as something that's normal or just hard to be patient and empathic, just like you shared?
Yeah, get your own support. So there's lots of communities online and in person for parents who have kids who have mental health issues. So get yourself some support so that you can talk to people who've been through this as well, because it's really helpful, especially at the beginning, when maybe you don't understand things or you don't know what resources are there. It's really helpful to have your own community of people that you can go to and say, hey, I don't know what to do here. Or has anybody gone through this with their kid? And, you know, it kind of reminds me of the phone call you were talking about earlier, but it's a helpful phone call because you're talking to people who understand and who have resources, and it's not being done in a judgmental way. It's being done in a resourceful way, a resilient way. So, you know, as somebody who has kiddos with mental health issues and 2 neurodivergent kiddos with ADHD and autism, that was really confusing for me. And I, even as a nurse practitioner, I did not know a lot about it. And so being able to go online and get into communities where they said, oh my gosh, you need to go here. And here's a really great resource. And this is a great therapist in your area. And, oh, have you been to this place? And hey, you know, even a simple thing, like I remember people saying, oh, you're going to Legoland, make sure that you get one of their sensory kits because it'll help your child feel less anxious because the loud noises won't bother them. Things like that make such a difference. And you wouldn't know about them if you hadn't been exposed to that community. So yeah, reach out and find other people who are going through what you're going through and ask for help.
Nice. I think the key here is acceptance, right?
I'm sorry?
I have one question more for you. I don't know if we still have time or not. Jackson again.
We'll take one question.
I was like, if Lizzie has time, I have time.
Thanks, Lily. Dr. Lee. My question is there a relationship between depression and high blood pressure? Because sometimes in our community, when somebody is sick of high blood pressure, people usually say, what are you thinking about? What thoughts do you have? I mean, this is kind of our diagnosis, which I don't know if it's right or not, but is there a relationship to that?
So there is yes, absolutely. There is a relationship.
Dr. Lee, let me add this to the question.
Yeah,
they will say, oh, this person has high blood. Oh, the child made them have high blood because the child is so stubborn. They don't listen. So that's why they have high blood. So there's always some relation to something.
I have heard all sorts of my own family's idioms around how the kids are giving their parents all sorts of medical issues with the stress that they're causing. Yes. So high blood pressure and anxiety actually have a connection. And it's usually because high blood pressure feels the feeling of your heart having to pump harder because your blood pressure is higher can cause you to feel anxious. So it's actually the other way around. Usually, if you have really high blood pressure, you feel anxious. And what we also know is that high blood pressure isn't necessarily caused by depression. And we see high blood pressure in people who have depression sometimes because we don't move as much. We don't exercise. We sometimes eat foods that aren't good for our hearts. And we have higher levels of inflammation in our body when we get depressed, especially just due to some of the things that happen. So that can absolutely lead to high blood pressure. So they're not usually directly connected. And if you have depression for years, decades, there it would not be surprising to me if somebody had had that for a really long time to see the development of high blood pressure, other health issues in their cardiovascular system, their heart, their blood vessels, or in their immune systems. Actually, we see it a lot too. But other than that, it's just a saying that we say our kids give us high blood pressure because they're stressing us out.
Wow, good questions, great answers, Dr. Lee. I want to open up maybe 2 to 3 minutes to the audience if they have any comments they want to make. In the meantime, maybe you can just think about how you can share with the audience, how they can connect with you later. And we would love to have you back, but let's just hear what the audience has to say.
Yeah, I would be honored.
I would love her back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Are you going to come back?
Oh, if you'll have me, I will gladly come back.
Yes, I have some
want to
advocacy
talk to
questions, which I'll
Please
get
close
to
this
you
down and
later on.
Okay.
Through Dr. Lee.
Sure.
Okay.
They just go ahead and ask the questions.
Okay. I was going to ask Dr. Lee if it's possible to link up. From this session, you can tell that there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to assure you that everything you have explained is happening in our community, in our societies. And there's every indication that there's need for help. And unfortunately, in our setting in Africa, or in Cameroon in particular, and in Boya especially, we have very limited personnel who can help. I wish to find out if you can link up our community and yours, or with some stakeholders who can ensure continuity with such capacity building, such that we have many more people who can be of help. Earlier on, we talked about cultural differences. I want to assure you that with globalization, everything, the world is becoming a small unit.
Mm-hmm.
And we have all of these things rampant in our community, but our society or our cultural differences is ascribing different appellations to them. For example, you have terms like stubbornness, laziness for withdrawals, stupidity for retardation, and dirtiness for some victims who start who are slow on self-care.
Mm-hmm.
So all these ascriptions are a kind of, I call it denial of the real problems. And we have, like I said earlier, very limited or personnel who lack capacity to identify or detect these issues, these mental health issues, until when it has escalated. So there's need for us to have many more people who can attend to, who are trained, properly trained, and have the capacity to identify these issues in our community. So I'm advocating that you can link us up so that we have many of such trainings and many of your likes who can even come over here and volunteer with us for a period of time and train many more people.
That's a fabulous idea, and definitely is something we can look at exploring, because and thank you for the ask. One of the things that and this answers a little bit of what Lizzie just asked me to think about, we have a podcast with over 80 episodes on it that can be really useful if anybody would like to listen in to those, and I can make sure that we have the link for that. And we also have yes, we also have a Facebook group where we do trainings and we have community there, and we would absolutely love to have anybody who feels called to join to come there, because that is it's one of the I would say it's one of the safest places on the internet because we're really, really intentional about how we set it up. And so if that feels like a good resource for anybody, you're welcome there. And I think what you're speaking to is really, really crucial because, and I see so many correlations between, the culture in which I grew up in here in America around laziness and stubbornness and not following, not being respectful. Ooh, that word, respectful, right? That is a big thing. And also there being a lot of mental health disorders diagnosed in relation to the aftermath of what happens when our family feels like we're not being respectful or we're being lazy or we're being, all of these things that really are connected to mental health. So absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I can't see on my screen. Who said that?
That was Beatrice. Beatrice and
Beatrice. Okay, great. Yes. No, I would love to connect further, please.
Definitely. Beatrice is a friend, so I can connect both of you after this session. I know there's one last question.
Yeah, Jackson's question.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, Jackson, that's a really great question. And thank you for bringing it here because it's something that I don't think we talk about enough. Sexual performance in men and depression. We know that that there is a link between testosterone levels in men and depression. And so sometimes lower testosterone levels lead to depression. Sometimes depression leads to lower testosterone levels. And there's lots of other things that can be connected with this as well. And anxiety is also something that we see related to sexual performance in men, just in general. So anxiety and depression can be a huge source of stress when it comes to one's sexual life, both for men and women. It's something that affects both or all genders and sexes. So it is definitely depression and anxiety really weave their way into every facet of our lives, especially when it gets more serious and significant. And so it's something to, a lot of times in America, if we have a man who says, oh, I'm having trouble from a sexual performance perspective, we just say, oh, here's a pill, instead of going, hey, what's going on? Right. And sometimes it's physiological, it's age, it's other things, high blood pressure affects it too. And other times there's something psychological that we really get to dive into and look at that can be healed and resolved, and that your sexual experience can get much better.
That's a huge topic. Maybe that will be the next one when you come back.
Well, and I was Lizzie, and I was looking at your website before I came on here, and I was like, oh my gosh, we could talk about so many things because, from a trauma perspective, there's the domestic violence piece and the all of it. So yes.
All of it, yes. And thank you so much. I'm sure we've covered all the questions. Very impressive presentation, very informative. I want everybody to know when I reached out to Dr. Lee, she gets paid doing this, but she told me she would do it for absolutely free. She's willing to share her resources with us because she understands. She understands what first-generation immigrants can be dealing with in a Western culture. And also people back home, we listen to Beatrice, it's different now. So we cannot say, oh no, in Cameroon it's different, in America. The children are going through the same form of depression and we need to pay attention and get them the help that they need. So thank you. Again, this was brought to you by the Just Like You Global Foundation. I want to especially thank all the volunteers who do work with us for free. We don't have money yet, but if you feel like we're doing great work and you would like to donate, please by all means visit our website and donate. I want to thank Dr. Marie Malesube for pushing me and making sure we get this done, because it was about time for the community to engage in conversations like this. And also very thankful, Dr. Lee, for doing this. glad to hear you say you're willing to come back. So we look forward to you maybe to talk about the whole sexual thing. I like that. I like that topic a lot. So thank you. And thank you, audience, listening and asking the right questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the Sunday.